the webinar series of the Gateway Cities Alliance, hosted by the University of Newcastle. I'm Will Rifkin of the Hunter Research Foundation Center at the Uni of Newcastle. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, paying my respects to elders past and present in the host cities. And that would be the Awabakal and the Warramai people in Newcastle, the Darawal people in Wollongong, and the Watarung people in Geelong. The session format includes an introduction by the Lord Mayor of the City of Newcastle, Councillor Nuatali Nelms. That'll be followed by a presentation by Rob Tyson of Polis Partners on what I refer to as the Goldilocks Cities report, on how our gateway cities stand out in terms of their recent economic growth and the inclusiveness of that growth. That'll be followed by a launch of the Gateway Cities Alliance dashboard, which I'll do. And then there will be a question and answer with the speakers, Rob and myself. So I'd like to introduce the Lord Mayor to deliver her address. Councillor Nuatali Nelms has served on Newcastle Council since 2008. And in the last 6 years, she served as Lord Mayor. She's been a great supporter of the Gateway Cities Alliance and of the university. And now, over to Okay, over to the Lord Mayor for her introductory address.
Oh, hello, Will. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you for inviting me to join this webinar today with Hunter Research Foundation. It's my pleasure to be here together with the Gateway Cities Alliance. What I wanted to let this group know about was our response to the COVID-19 crisis through the implementation of a $5.5 million community and economic resilience package. That was designed to put an immediate cash flow and financial assistance both to the community sector and to provide assistance to small business and social assistance providers. Part of that package we developed at the City of Newcastle was developed very early on with our emergency response team, and that was ratified by Council in March. So the rapid response grants in terms of providing support to the community sector were basically getting that money straight out before obviously the processes had happened at a state or national level in terms of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, because there was an immediate need in our local communities when travel restrictions started and so on. At the same time, we established a city task force, and that was established to provide expert advice and confidence to the community that we were united in our approach in terms of employers in the region, very large employers. So that task force has 17 members. That really did probably take up most of the large employers in the region, as well as union representation and representation specifically from sectors like the arts, tourism and hospitality that were very adversely affected by the onset of COVID-19. We see that gateway cities have a very unique role to play, not only right now in the development of our nation and also our local communities, but also a very important role in our economic recovery as a nation. Just the impact for us locally, the population in Newcastle, just similar to all of your areas, and I know I have a lot of people from Newcastle here, hello. Almost 1 in 10 Novocastrians have been out of work, unemployed, which actually drops down to 1 in 5 if you're aged between 18 and 25. So youth unemployment is obviously a very big issue for us here in Newcastle and the Hunter, particularly as a result of COVID-19. We have over 11,000 people on job seeker and youth allowance. And prior to the September deadline, which has obviously thankfully just come and gone and been extended through to March, we had 42% of our businesses in our LGA on JobKeeper. So we see all levels of government having a very significant role to play in our economic recovery. What we have done at a local government level is provided targeted support and looking for those areas that have been most affected in our local economy, which is not that dissimilar to other economies around Australia and around the world. And that's in the arts and cultural space, hospitality, recreation and tourism. Having the JobKeeper and JobSeeker in our local economies has also been exceptionally helpful, we believe, but there is a time that is going to come out and we need to all be preparing for that time. The economic response, the $5.5 million, saw over $800,000 of that go directly into community response. Part of that has been rapid response grants. We had that program in place, as I said, from March, and the task force leaders that we had gathered together are looking now at the new opportunities that we can, as a group that is collaborating very closely on the economic recovery of the city. And not that we haven't touched base with and aligned on a number of large issues for the city in the past. This has also provided a new platform for us to stay in touch and also share information. One of the really important things that I have learned through this is the importance of the real-time data and having a resource like the Research Foundation here in the city has been able to provide myself in my capacity in local government, but also significant industry leaders and business leaders from around the city. Lots of different data sets and real-time data about what's actually happening right now in our local economy. And that real-time data has been very important in terms of really focusing our advocacy. So, we recognised, the effect on the youth, and we had very organised advocacy right straight through to our state and federal decision makers around the need for the increased support to young people in traineeships and apprenticeships. And a lot of that information was sent off quite early to the federal government, and we've seen a good response from the federal government, particularly around the traineeships and apprenticeships, which I think will make a difference, particularly in cities like Newcastle that do have a higher than the state average youth unemployment. We are also in the process of developing our new economic development strategy, which will obviously now have a specific component responding directly to the economic crisis that COVID-19 has created, but also focusing on the role that we can all play in job creation for a gateway city like Newcastle over the next decade. We recognise that Newcastle, like Wollongong, is definitely not a regional town, but it is not a capital city either. So we're very passionate, together with Wollongong and Geelong, in advocating for the role of gateway cities in our national economy. So we've just put in quite a detailed submission to the New South Wales Government's inquiry into government grants, advocating for that three-level approach. So obviously capital, metropolitan, gateway city, which is obviously defined by this alliance between Newcastle, Wollongong and Geelong, as well as regional. During that process, we identified over $170 million that just by just the city's LGA boundaries alone being classified differently, either as metro or regional, we miss out on $170 million worth of grant funding. And I know that Wollongong in New South Wales is in the same position. And when you're looking at, taking the pressure off capital cities and, the exponential expansion of Western Sydney, and so on, right through into, that southern, the southern boundaries into the Blue Mountains, there you can see that there is a focus needed on that metropolitan gateway city and infrastructure that is very specifically metropolitan style infrastructure, but just not in a capital city. So we're talking about the rapid transit networks in CBDs. The Newcastle CBD is actually, home to, the lion's share of the jobs in the region. So you'll see a lot of people that commute into the Newcastle CBD from our, neighbouring local government areas. And also it is a gateway through to regional Australia, much more so than metropolitan CBD of Sydney and New South Wales. And that needs a very specific type of funding and infrastructure spend from state and federal governments. We have the majority of our workforce is actually captured within the region, so it's not a commuter-based workforce. Aside from coming in from external LGAs into the city. But we have been able to recognise that particularly like a lot of places, and probably had less of an effect than major metropolitan areas in recognising that there is an ability now and to work from home. And we see that, as we have identified in a number of the collaborative documents we have put together with the Gateway Cities Alliance, is that lifestyle choice that cities like Newcastle, Wollongong and Geelong offer, and that quality of life being able to be offered, and also with the ability, ensuring that we have the right technology in place so people can work from home. And that will likely be a game changer for cities like ours, I think, over the next decade, because people realise that they don't necessarily need to be in the capital city metropolitan heart to actually do some of those, higher value professional service jobs. I'm really looking forward to the presentation by Rob Tyson and the work that he has done, and also interested to see the dashboard that Professor Will Rifkin has developed for the Alliance. So without further ado, I'll hand back over to Will, and thank you very much for your participation today.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Your remarks about how things are going during the COVID-19 lockdowns and recovery relate really well to what Rob Tyson and I are discussing today. We assemble data and then connect the dots to tell the story and to make the case for our gateway cities locally and nationally. Rob Tyson, our guest speaker, is CEO of Polis Partners. He has extensive experience securing funding for major infrastructure and urban renewal investments. He employs emerging data sources to ensure that in investments and public debates, there's a sound and uncontested evidence base. He has a diverse industry background: transportation, urban design, economic development, tourism, defense industry, population policy, and welfare reform. Prior to establishing Polis Partners, a strategy and policy-based economic consultancy, Rob led the economics and policy practice at PwC. And now over to Rob.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Will, and thank you, Madam Lord Mayor, and thank you everyone for zooming in and joining with us journey here today. I'm going to quickly talk about data and what that currently tells us about how Newcastle, Geelong and Wollongong are travelling through these turbulent economic times. So there were 4 areas I was going to briefly touch on today. The first was just a bit of a background to the work I do, so you understand the context to what I'm talking about. The second thing I wanted to do was just look historically quickly, because the historical performance of the gateway cities has been very, very important. And a bit of a spoiler alert here, they have performed very well relative to the 101 other cities across Australia that we examine. The second thing I want to do is move from the historical to the current and look at some of these emerging indicators to see how the different cities are coping with COVID and what the impacts have been. And then finally, I want to actually look forward into the recovery phase of what hopefully soon to be entering recovery phase, and just mine some of the data we use in a bit more detail to pass on a couple of insights around infrastructure and some other aspects of what that recovery could look like. So let me just quickly get my presentation up. So in terms of that first section of just some of the background to the research we've done, at Polis Partners, we've started tracking the performance of 101 cities and towns across Australia. And we try and do this in what we think is a pretty simple, meaningful, consistent and timely fashion. It's simple because we use two key lenses. The first lens is economic growth and the second is inclusive growth. So economic growth captures many of the traditional measures that people are comfortable with and we'll see reported in the media on a day-to-day basis. And that includes things like business growth and employment, construction pipeline and population growth. On the inclusive side of the equation, we have things like unemployment rates and also welfare dependency. And the key to having inclusive growth there is we want to understand how economic growth is actually translating in a location to more opportunities for the local population. And it's this aspect around inclusive growth that we think makes the approach quite meaningful and also quite unique, because it's not all about economic growth for the sake of economic growth, which is often the mantra. We want to see this actually. We want to see any economic growth actually translating into opportunities for the local population. We try to keep all the analysis and everything I'm going to chat about today, it's all very consistent between the cities and towns across Australia. And the way that we've managed to do that is not trying to compare Newcastle with Sydney, because any kid in Year 6 will tell you there's a multitude of reasons why you can't necessarily compare one town to the other. But what we actually do is compare each city and town to its historical average. So we want to understand, is Newcastle, is Geelong, is Wollongong over or underperforming historical averages in a lot of these key areas? And the towns and the cities and the gateway cities that I mentioned that are performing strongly, they're performing strongly relative to their historical growth. So that's a very important point to note. And finally, this is as timely. We try to make this timely. So we update this twice a year. We use government data. There's always lags in government data, but it's as close to sort of near time or real time as we can get with these official sources. So that gives you a bit of a background to some of the work that's encapsulated in our report, the City Report. If I now duck down into the overall results of what we've seen recently, and this was where things stood at the end of 2019. I'll draw everyone's attention to the top right-hand quadrant, because in that top right-hand quadrant, you have towns, cities, and smaller regions that are growing. They're growing in an inclusive manner, and they're also growing in an economic sense. So that top right quadrant is really where you want to be. And you can see there that Geelong, Wollongong, Newcastle have all performed really quite strongly in this respect. They've all been leading the pack. And this led to, as Will mentioned, these have sort of been dubbed the Goldilocks cities, along with places like Ballarat and some of the areas around the Sunshine Coast. These are the sort of places that are not too big, they're not too small. There's just the right amount of opportunities for jobs. There's industry diversity. There's the amenity and attractions that come with the larger towns, but you're not getting the crowds and the prices and the traffic that you're getting with many of the capital city counterparts. So a very important group of cities, and one that is playing out in terms of the data in quite a strong story. And remember, when we're talking about how they're performing, this is all performance relative to their historical averages. So to get to the next level of detail and actually understand exactly how well some of the gateway cities did, I've got a bit of a snapshot of some of the results up here. So you've got the overall ranking of each of the cities across Australia there in the first column. We've got how it then ranked on the economic criteria, and then finally how it ranked on the inclusive growth criteria. And as I flagged at the start, all of the gateway cities made the top 10, so top 10 out of 101 cities and towns across Australia. So this meant that they're currently significantly outperforming their historical trajectories or historical performance, and they're doing that in a manner that is a lot more than any other cities and towns. So we've got Geelong there, came second overall. The key characteristics and the thing to highlight about Geelong there was the strong performance both on the economic growth and the inclusive growth. So that was actually quite unique, scoring so well on both, but it really shows that there is a nexus between the growth that Geelong has seen in things like population, business growth, and the like, that is actually translating into meaningful drops in welfare dependency and some of those other inclusive growth measures. In terms of Newcastle, it was ranked 4th overall, and it was the top New South Wales city. Its results were slightly skewed towards economic growth performance. Some of this was driven by the Maitland Hospital investment, because when we look at Newcastle, we look at Newcastle and Maitland as the region. We also saw strong growth in the number of jobs and also the number of businesses in the locality to lay some really quite solid foundations. And when you look at Wollongong, which came 8th overall and was the second New South Wales city, you see quite a similar story playing out, in that it was a more of an economic growth story rather than inclusive growth story. But in the case of Wollongong, you also had quite a number of people coming off welfare payments, which helped their score there. So this is where things ended up at the end of 2019, and of course that is a big caveat, because this is all then pre-COVID. But I think that is still very, very important. It's important for a couple of reasons, because it highlights the trajectory that many cities and towns were on prior to the turbulence that we've currently seen. One of the things about all this data is you actually start to see some very individual nuances and unique identities coming through. And these trajectories and identities are very important when these turbulent times start, because they come to resilience and they come to how well a location is going to be able to rebound or recover. So in a sense, the reason I've spent a bit of time talking about the historical, although it seems an absolute age ago now, is because this essentially forms a bit of a pre-COVID baseline of which to understand location strengths or weaknesses prior to the current economic turbulence, but also then to measure what is working and what is not working in terms of recovery, to make sure that as we come through the end of 2020, into 2021, into 2022, we are actually starting to see meaningful improvements, both from an economic perspective, but probably more importantly, that inclusive growth perspective, that people in these locations are still getting the opportunities and still getting the opportunity to get back on their feet. So this brings me to my second point then, which the Lord Mayor has already touched on, and it looks at some of the current impacts of COVID-19 on these cities. And the way I've done this is by looking at unemployment rates. So this, of course, is one of the measures that we examine in the city report. And coming into COVID, all of the cities had very, very good unemployment rates. So all below 5%, actually down towards sort of the historical low levels for all three cities, Newcastle, Wollongong and Geelong. In Newcastle, you had approximately, this is in just sort of prior to COVID, you had approximately 13,000 people looking for work. And in Geelong and Wollongong, you had about 6,000 people in both locations looking for work. What I've then tried to do is use the latest JobKeeper data, so June.JobKeeper data put out by ATO and Treasury, to understand what COVID has actually meant for the local unemployment rates. And as you can see here, they've ticked up markedly. So in the case of Wollongong, we've had the greatest increase. So the unemployment rates jumped up to over 11% from around 4.8%. So what this means is in addition to those 6,000 people that were already looking for work prior to COVID, what we've seen is around another 8,000 people that within the Wollongong area that are now accessing JobKeeper claims. Newcastle unemployment rate has jumped up to sort of to the 9 to 10% range, with around 11,000 people on JobKeeper, and Geelong has just over 5,000 people on JobKeeper. So you can see there quite a stark jump, as one would expect, with a shock, both a health, social and economic shock of this magnitude. The couple of caveats that I just draw to your attention here, which I think are interesting to ponder, is first, this actually probably underestimates the true impact of COVID-related unemployment. So as the Lord Mayor pointed out, there are pockets within the community which will be much more adversely affected, such as the youth or such as certain skilled workers. But this JobKeeper data is also based on the location of a head office. So what this data is really saying is that there were 8,000 job seeker claims in, for example, in let's say Newcastle. There were 8,000 claims that were linked to head offices in the Newcastle region. This means that if someone was working for Qantas but lived in Newcastle, their JobKeeper claim would actually be counted in Sydney because that is where the head office is. So there's reason to believe there's actually probably a bit of an undercount of unemployment by using this JobKeeper information to look at the gateway cities, whereas in the capital cities like Sydney and Melbourne, you've probably got a slight overestimation of the unemployment rate if you were to use this method to calculate it. The second important caveat is this is June. So this is prior to the second lockdown in Victoria, which will of course affect the results there for Geelong. So as we see successive data release, we'll be able to delve into that in a bit more detail. The final point I'd make here is that using this methodology, the unemployment rate across Australia is currently around 12.5% to 13%. So despite the caveats there around just how this is counted and changes that we see, all of the cities have actually fallen below that national level of 12.5% to 13% current unemployment rate. So I won't dwell on the current any further, but I wanted actually to finish off by just looking to the future, and particularly the role that infrastructure may play in the recovery. I think all levels of government and private sector as well has flagged the importance of infrastructure investment in this recovery. So what I've done here is just quickly again dig into the data in a bit more detail to understand what historic infrastructure spend per capita has been across different areas. And so I've done it on a per capita basis in a way to try and just normalize or make the infrastructure spend comparable between not only cities with 10,000 people, but places like gateway cities and also then of course the capital cities. And so what you see here are probably three implications or three things I'd draw your attention to. First, at the bottom there, we have the gateway cities. So that's roughly $1,500 spent on infrastructure investment per person in these locations. The second point though is the two lines above are Sydney and Melbourne, and at first blush you'd probably expect the infrastructure spend per capita here to be slightly lower than areas like the gateway cities and also regional and rural areas because you have more people, so you should be getting economies of scale. There's more people to defray the costs around. So it's interesting in the last, especially those last 4 years, just the additional investment that's gone into to the capital cities compared to say the gateway cities. One rationale for this could be that these figures pick up both public and private sector investment. So if the gap between the lines of gateway cities and the Sydney and Melbourne there is to do with the private sector investment and the greater private sector investment that these capital cities will usually achieve, then it also just underscores the importance of this private sector investment in also stimulating the recovery going forward. If it's just the government sector story, then again, it's important to understand how government infrastructure spending, and I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone on the line the importance of this, how infrastructure spending is actually being distributed around Australia and whether that is actually matching both the population densities, the population locations and the population needs. There's a huge infrastructure pipeline going forward. There was prior to COVID and it's got even bigger now. So making sure that infrastructure and the right amount of infrastructure investment and the right type of infrastructure investment is coming into the regions is going to be critical. So look, that brings me to the end of a very quick romp through some of the data and some of the insights that we're seeing in the cities report at the moment. Again, to recap, historically the gateway cities have been performing very strongly, and that has given them strong momentum coming into the current turbulence. We have seen unemployment spike. We are waiting on more data to understand and further understand exactly what the impacts are at each location. But when you start looking to the future, there are key things like infrastructure investment and how that is actually playing out in these locations, which I think is going to be pretty pivotal for not just the recovery of the gateway cities, but for Australia more generally. So I'll pause there now and hand back over to you, Will.
Great, thank you, Rob. Great, you've turned off screen sharing, excellent. Thank you for that presentation and a clear explanation. A few of you have started adding questions to the Q&A portion of the Zoom meeting. Feel free to go ahead and continue with that, and I will launch into my presentation. This launch, literally, it's the launch of the Gateway Cities Alliance dashboard. For those of you who did not know me, and for those of you who do, I'm still Will Rifkin with the Hunter Research Foundation Center. I'm labeled these days an applied regional economist, and my particular focus is on communication between experts and non-experts. And so that's what I'm going to try to do with this dashboard. So now I need to turn on my PowerPoint, turn on my share screen. And very great. All right, so launching this dashboard, I'd like to frame it in terms of launching the process of dashboarding, that is keeping track of relevant data on our gateway cities, but always updating, doing different versions to create different arguments. What these dashboards can do in providing this sort of data can help in, didn't do that very well. It can help with demythologizing. And that's something that those of us in these gateway cities are very concerned about, is how are our cities perceived in the state capital and the national capital. So the notion is to tell that news story, the story as we see it, the story based on what's actually happening here, rather than perceptions 20 years ago or 30 years ago. We need something that's public. We need something that's easy to understand. The data we provide has to have the right time scale on it, cover the right geographic area, has to enable comparisons between different cities in Australia, like between the gateway cities and the capital cities. The information has to be meaningful, it has to be convincing. It has to be affordable, timely, and updatable. And it benefits from having input from government, business, and community. So in some ways, this notion of making evidence public relates to that notion in the legal fraternity of estoppel. And what the Gateway Cities Alliance report that came out about, I don't know, 10 months ago is an example. You make a glossy report, lots of information, launch it publicly. You then cannot deny that that information is there. And that's what the definition of estoppel says. If you go to Google Dictionary, it precludes a person from asserting something as contrary to what's been accepted by a previous statement or action. So if we make the conditions and the performance of our cities more public, it prevents people from, in the state government or federal government or outside investors, from adhering to an old version or an old view of our cities. So here's an example from that dashboard of jobs in manufacturing across the 3 cities. We know that the proportion of jobs in manufacturing has been declining for several decades in these 3 cities. It's something 3 cities shares, that history of manufacturing. And so what the dashboard does is it shows these downward sloping curves and it makes the message simple. We can also look at population and how it's been growing over a period of time in Newcastle, Geelong, and Wollongong. And the notion is to, on that horizontal axis, to use the right time scale, whether it's 10 years or 50 years. So this is a long-term trend. It's not a little bit of noise in the data set. And you say, okay, well, those are our gateway cities. What about the real growth story in Gold Coast? How does that compare to our gateway cities? And if you look at that population chart on the dashboard, you can see the Gold Coast has, the population growth there has been quite dramatic. And so what the dashboard does is it enables that sort of comparison, but it also alerts us to the notion of, are we looking at the right spatial scale? The Gold Coast, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the ABS started counting Tweed heads as well, a portion of New South Wales. So you would have seen an upward tick in population simply because a greater area was being encompassed. So with any of this data, the notion is, are we measuring on the right spatial scale, right, same comparative scale over time? If we look at employment in healthcare and social assistance, that's the highest, the sector with the greatest proportion of employment across the 10 largest cities in Australia. So what that shows across our cities is that Newcastle has the highest share of employment in healthcare and social assistance, and it's a higher proportion than in one of the capital cities, and in Sydney or in Melbourne. So it's meaningful. That shows in this comparison, you get something out that has implications. In Newcastle, some people refer to it as a city of makers due to both the manufacturing, but also the strength of the arts sector. Let's see what the dashboard tells us about that. So if you look at the proportion of the workforce employed in arts and recreation services, you'll see, interestingly, Newcastle ranks just below Wollongong and Geelong. And so though people in Newcastle may not be aware of the growth of the Arts and Recreation Centre in Geelong. If we bring in the capital cities, you'll see that Sydney and Melbourne rank in terms of proportion of employment in arts and recreation services above the gateway cities. If we bring in Hobart, you can see that ranks above Melbourne and Sydney. And people recognize, they know the notion of Mona and Salamanca markets being examples of what we see as the arts and recreation services within Hobart. But what if we look at our friend, the Gold Coast? You can see that ranks even higher than Hobart, with 3% of the workforce in arts and recreation services. So is that convincing to call Newcastle having a strong arts sector? Are we measuring the right thing here? Is this proportion of the workforce in a particular area really the way to capture it? Particularly when you consider that in the Gold Coast, Sophie Monk would be considered as employed in arts and recreation services. Is that really the sector of the creative industries and recreation services that we'd like to look at? We can also look at more timely data. This isn't on the Gateway Cities dashboard. It's on another dashboard just applying to Newcastle, but looking at the impact of COVID-19. And this shows the number of new cases of COVID-19 infections and the road traffic. And here we can see how as the number of cases increased and there were the economic shutdowns, the magnitude of the road traffic decreased to where, and then it bounced back. So as of mid-July, we were back to 80% of normal weekday traffic during a peak time period on a Wednesday afternoon. On weekends, the volume of road traffic has returned to the normal level. Tells you about the extent of the economic shutdown as well as the extent of social distancing. So here you can use a dashboard. It's illustrated how you can use a dashboard to provide data that's timely, but also affordable. The data on the COVID-19 infections came from New South Wales Health, and the data on traffic levels came from Transport for New South Wales, who set us spreadsheets every month or two on how the traffic was going. Then the question becomes, what else would you like to see? That notion of these dashboards benefiting from input in people in government, community, and business. So here's rent by local government area. And there on the right side, you can see the city of Newcastle. And as you go down, you can see Maitland, a very fast growing suburb, about half hour's drive outside Newcastle. Another half an hour to an hour further out is Singleton, where the mining community is strong, and another hour down the road is Musselbrook, another mining town. Those are rent on a 3-bedroom house. And you can say, what would happen? Oh, I got a little bit of a problem here. Here we go. What would happen if we added coal prices to that? And here you can see below thermal coal prices and how they peaked in December, January 2007, 2008, sometime during the year 2008. And then 4 years later, the rents peaked in Maitland well, not in Maitland a bit, in Singleton and Musselbrook. There was overbuilding, then the rents declined, and then they picked up back again on the historical trend. So here with input from government, business, and community, you can get a sense of what is it we really need to be looking at and over what time scale? What other factors could go into this dashboard? And in that way, because the dashboard is a reason for the sectors to come together, it can be referred to as what's called a boundary object. And in assembling these dashboards, we want to make sure that we use international leading practices. And here's an example from Dublin, who's developed their dashboard development was led by Rob Tyson at a university, Maintooth University there. And he's a great critic of dashboards, but a great creator as well. You can see here in their chart for house completions, how they've got some of that COVID-19 impact picked up, with a number of house completions declining dramatically, but also an illustration of the long-term trends. So here's what the home page of the Gateway Cities Alliance dashboard looks like. Consider a dashboard 1.0, something that really needs input from people like yourselves, saying what should we be tracking over what time frame and comparing what cities. And you can see there at the top, it has options for what you can compare, what indicators, is it unemployment, is it employment different industry sectors? Do you want to compare different indicators for a single city? And at the bottom, there's the selection of cities you can look at. Here's the URL, and soon enough, this link will be provided from the Gateway Cities Alliance website itself. So as I alluded to, it's not a dashboard that's cast in concrete. I'm thinking more of the notion of dashboarding. It's not the board you're watching, it's the performance and the conversations about it. And so from this little illustration, you've seen the notion of it makes data public, and that helps that demythologizing, saying once this information is public, you can no longer view these cities through a very old lens. It simplifies. It shouldn't just provide data, it should really provide a focus on key questions. The scale has to be right, both the time scale and the geographic scale. It enables comparisons. The data should be meaningful and it needs to be convincing. The accumulation of the data in the presentation has to be done in a way that's affordable. It has to be timely. It has to be relevant to issues we're concerned about. It has to be updatable. And it's a reason for government, business, and community to come together and decide what's the story that we really need to be telling. And as I alluded to before, it then can become a boundary object, a reason for conversations based on evidence across those sectors, government, business, and community, and between people who live in our cities and our regions, and those people outside of its state government, federal government, or the business sector that may be considering investing. And here are some references you can see when you get the PowerPoints later. So what I'm looking for is, a notion of a partnership, because in looking at the future of our cities and our regions, the notion of getting multiple stakeholders across government, business, and community to agree on how to create that future is a daunting task. A first step can be seen to be agreeing on what to measure. So we're really looking for city and regional partners. And if I'm clever, I can put together a proposal for the Australian Research Council where they'll pay 75% of the cost of developing these dashboards, of doing this dashboarding process, but also assessing it. To what extent is this effective? And is this a process that other cities and regions should be engaging in? So again, here's the launch of the Gateway Cities Alliance Dashboard 1.0, or a launch into dashboarding generally. Here we go. I've stopped sharing. And now, if Rob can get back online, and we can handle some of the questions you've presented us with. Let me do view, gallery view, and we'll go into the question and answer period. So we go up to the top. So Rob, what would you like to add in terms of the economic impacts of COVID-19 on the cities that ranked highest in your analysis? Oh, you're still on mute?
Apologies.
Perfect.
I think this comes back to the different trajectories that the different towns and different cities and different regions had come into COVID. Wollongong, Geelong, Newcastle were all very lucky in that they were performing strongly prior to the current times. There were many cities which had existing challenges, which means there's already weaknesses both from an economic and an inclusive perspective that will have only been exacerbated by the current conditions. So I think understanding that historic trajectory, understanding how that historic trajectory can actually be used through these current periods and built on to assist recovery, I think is pretty important.
All right. Your graph shows infrastructure spend in the capital cities being greater than in the rest. And then you had also mentioned some of that would be private spend, some would be public spend.
Yeah.
And the question is, why is the infrastructure spend not more distributed into the regions? And I think that means the government infrastructure spend to offset the resources already available in those regions. So if all the spend is in the cities, then you need resources in the cities, once again, increasing the need. So a bit saying there's a bit of a vicious cycle. If the spend's in the city, that's where the people and the resources will be spent.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. It's one I actually don't have a full answer for. As I said, I put together some of this analysis quite quickly to try and explore it for this type of forum. There are a couple of things which I think are relevant to consider. Just on the back end envelope there, I was just looking at last year's figures. So you had, say, 30, I think it's about 39 or 40% of the population that live in Sydney and Melbourne, but they got about 51% of that total infrastructure spend. So you can already sort of see an imbalance between where that spend is going and where the population actually is. I mean, that will change on a year-by-year basis, of course, but I think trying to find a degree of parity there, I think is an important goal to strive for. In terms of why, I don't have a full answer. As Will mentioned, there is that private sector component, which I think is important, and to do a true, I've actually put in a request for the data to understand it on just a pure government level spend. So that's a work in progress. The other factor is there is also a higher cost of delivering some infrastructure in different locations. So the same rail line or the same hospital in Geelong or Wollongong or Newcastle that is built in Sydney will cost more in Sydney. There's tunnelling, there's brownfield development as opposed to greenfield development. So there is also just a bit of a cost impost, I think, that comes with the capital cities. But again, it's all early stages, and I wouldn't want to nail my colours to the mast, but I suspect that cost difference wouldn't be enough to explain the full magnitude of the gap that you see between the lines.
Very good. Another question for you regarding inclusive growth beyond government support and unemployment. What other measures and indicators of inclusive growth could you imagine including? And which data sources could you tap into to measure these additional inclusive growth indicators? And what are the challenges in doing that?
That's another good question. There's probably a 2-hour Zoom session just on that one. Look, there's a lot of different ways that you could continue to measure this, and there's a lot of data sources I'd love to have. The reason that we've settled on those two to begin with, so we are actually exploring some at the moment, is simply because we want to make sure that one, they're timely, so the information comes out at a regular occurrence. There's some great information in the public realm that is, say, produced every 4 years through census or other things, which is very insightful, but we want something that gives us sort of that as close to real time as possible. We also want to make sure that we can look at it on a city-by-city basis. So we don't necessarily just want to look at state data, because we want to understand what's actually playing out in each city by itself. Individually. So that's why we've used those two sources at the moment. In terms of actually what we're looking to incorporate, there's two things I'd say. The first is we're looking to get some qualitative feedback, so running surveys across the top. So I think including a qualitative angle with your quantitative data is always really interesting, because a lot of the inclusive growth, you can measure it objectively, but I think there's also a subjective element which we'd like to capture. So that's the first point. The second point is we also want to dive just below the city level, because actually that inclusive growth can differ significantly within cities. So what I've talked about today are cities, but all of our data actually exists on a much more granular level. So actually understanding how inclusive growth differs from, say, an eastern part of a city to a western part of a city is as important, if not more important, I think, from a policy perspective, in terms of how you specify policy responses and what investment can actually go into place, and critically then how you measure that investment and how you measure the return from policy. So yes, including a qualitative angle, and also then actually diving down sort of below the city level of the two areas we want to go there. There's a wealth of other health and social services data I'd love to use, but there's a lot of data access issues associated with those, which are there for very good reasons.
Yeah, and I'd second that in terms of, dashboard creation. It's that granularity that's really useful, going deep dive below the local government area. And that's what I found in my previous work in Queensland is people at state government were saying, we know what's going on at the LGA level. What we don't know is what's going on at the town level. And the benefit of one of the many benefits of COVID-19 is the release of big data by large organizations, like Google and Apple on their transport, where people are moving, that sort of thing. And so there's the hope that we can get some data even down to the postcode level, from private providers. And as you alluded to, there are privacy concerns, confidentiality concerns, and my sense is these things will be sorted out over the next few years, people becoming comfortable sharing small amounts, and then being able to get that discrimination at a finer scale. The volume of data can be daunting as well, and one way around that is to just sample. You look for hotspots. It's like, what's happening in that hotspot? An area of particular need or an area of particular growth. So you're not trying to get massive volumes of data, because often people can be, the data holders can be very circumspect about releasing large volumes of data for people to go fishing in. But if you know that there's an area of particular need, that's good news to the data provider, because they get a benefit of helping the community or the region to attend to that. We have another question for you, Rob. What's been the response from experts in the capital cities to your analysis?
It's probably been a bit more muted, actually, compared to the responses by, for example, Newcastle, Wollongong, and Geelong. I think the capital city stories at a whole interesting. There was an immediate rush to compare the performance of Sydney versus Melbourne. So that's always of interest around the coffee table. So that was one of the key things people gravitated towards. I think when it came to the discussions I'm having with the capital cities, though, is getting down to that much more granular level. Because again, Sydney as a whole is a spatial construct, but actually the things that people are experiencing, and the same in Melbourne, things that are happening in that northwest of Melbourne versus the inner east of Melbourne, they're entirely different. So the work and the interest, I think, from those larger cities, the capital cities, has been understanding what's actually happening at a much more granular, be it at an SA2 or a postcode or an LGA level. And using that to feed into, okay, so what is the impact of COVID-19 been on the local populations? Because, as I say, this report actually came out quite close to when all the turbulence really became front and foremost for most people. So it was caught up in a lot of those discussions.
Yeah, and there may be some hope in New South Wales with the state government using the term precinct a lot more. Looking on developing particular precincts, and the hope is they'll take a same attitude toward getting data that's relevant to precincts.
And I have been, again, this data has been used in precinct work previously. I think it's a very nice way to understand what the nature and the character of a precinct is before a major investment, and then actually being able to track the impact of that precinct on that local area, but not just that local area, all the surrounding areas as you move out from that precinct. Because those areas are also critical and need to be considered in any thought through investment and policy.
Good. So if somebody gave you a project, enough funding to do whatever you wanted as a next step with this sort of analysis, what would you do?
That's a great question. So actually the thing I would try and, there's a couple of other data sources which would give close to real-time information on some of these areas. I would love to encapsulate those. The thing I would do, though, which I think would make it incredibly valuable and actually give it some longevity, is I would I'd wrap it up in a tool for schools, so that anyone and try and actually work with states and territories to get it in their curriculums, because I think actually understanding this sort of data and infusing it at a student level from, say, anywhere in primary school upwards, it gives people an understanding of the different dimensions of their local communities, and also just sort of equips them with the understanding of how they can then engage in the debate and make decisions as they enter sort of the voting age and the workforce type characteristics. So that's probably a bit of a boring answer, but I think actually getting this into the hands of a lot more people, especially younger people, would be actually fascinating and be really interesting.
Yeah, and so in some ways, what you stated reminds me of that notion about simulation. And there was a model, a computerized model that the University of Virginia and IBM collaborated on of the Chesapeake Bay and all of the different sources of pollution that affected the Chesapeake Bay. And that's what they did, is they made it a way for people to learn about cause and effect relationships and the scale of them. So I think that would be a great opportunity. And when I said to you, if somebody gave you the funding, what would you do? I'm reminded of sitting on a bus once next to a guy from the oil and gas industry, and I was telling him about the dashboard work and said, what would you do with $1 million? And I knew exactly what I would do. And what really annoyed me was, being in the oil and gas industry, he actually had $1 million. That's how much they spend to drill one well. And afterwards I realized there's no way he's going to give it to me to, put numbers on a screen, numbers and charts on a screen. But
one of the things that has been our approach coming in is there is such good data out there already. And I don't believe necessarily that there are huge data gaps. I think there are actually some of the biggest gains can be made from using publicly available government data that's actually quite simple, just in a different way to tell a story and to actually answer some of the most pressing problems that people are discussing at the moment. And that's really what we've tried to do here. There's 6 data sources. They've been produced by the Australian government for many, many years, and they're produced consistently. And what we're trying to do is just wrap them together in a way that tells a story that can inform a public policy debate. It can inform an investment debate. And I think that's actually at the heart of what we're trying to do is take some of this great data that's already out there and just use it and repackage it in different ways to make it tangible to many more people.
It's a great way to end the webinar, the notion of using data to tell a story. I think it's what both of us have been trying to do, and links to the opening comments by the Lord Mayor Newcastle. So I'd like to thank Newcastle and yourself, Rob Tyson. I appreciate you providing your presentations and engaging, responding with questions from the audience. I appreciate the audience providing those questions. We look forward to having you demand evidence in the future now that we've shown you that it's available. These webinars by the Gateway Cities Alliance are essential for examining and developing opportunities for national shifts in policy and investment that can benefit Australia by taking advantage of the assets of the capitals, of the gateway cities, not the assets of the capital cities. The next webinar in the series is on the future of work. It's to be hosted by the University of Wollongong. You can register on the website for the Gateway Cities Alliance. We're exploring topics in this webinar series that range from how our cities should value and finance public space. That could be one option, to how the housing market is going could be another option. And your suggestions for topics are always welcome. So have a great day.